You are the only one in this house who is not allowed to be selfish. My mother said it calmly, as if she were reminding me to lock the door before going out. No one objected, because in this family, that sentence had been repeated for many years, every time I lost something, so my younger sibling could gain something new. I was always the one who gave way. I gave up my bedroom, tuition money, and opportunities. I even gave up the most important decisions of my life. But what left me frozen was not the sacrifice itself. It was the fact that not once had those sacrifices made them treat me any better. On the contrary, they saw it as an obligation. And every time I hesitated, they called it selfishness. Until one day they told me, "You just need to take the loss one more time. Everything will be fine." What they did not say was that this time what they wanted me to give up was something I had traded nearly my entire youth to obtain. There is one thing I have always wondered, and maybe you have too. If in a family only one person is allowed to sacrifice forever, can that still be called love? Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something very simple. Where are you listening to this video right now? In the living room, in the car, or during a very quiet evening after everyone has gone to sleep? Leave a comment and let me know. If you have ever been the one who was always expected to be understanding, press like, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end. Because the moment I stopped sacrificing was also the moment everything in my family began to fall apart. That evening, we sat around the old wooden dining table, the one that had witnessed so many normal dinners that no one could remember what had ever been said. My father held a cup of cold coffee, his eyes fixed on the paper in the middle of the table. My younger sister leaned back in her chair, scrolling on her phone, occasionally looking up as if this had nothing to do with her. The paper was not a sales contract, not a loan agreement. It was just a proposal to adjust family benefits, as my mother called it. She slid it toward me very lightly. So lightly, it felt like a habit, like all the times before when I was expected to nod. "You just need to sign here," my mother said. "Nothing complicated. The family has already agreed." I looked at the small print at the bottom, the numbers, the clauses, the words written with a careful coldness. This was not the first time I had been asked to give something up, but it was the first time I realized they were no longer asking for my opinion. They said already agreed, as if my presence was now just a formality. I did not object right away. I folded the paper and placed it neatly along the edge of the table. That small movement made the room go quiet for a few seconds. My mother let out a long breath. My father checked his watch. My sister shrugged slightly. "I'll look it over," I said. My voice sounded strangely normal. As I stood up and left the table, I heard my mother say behind me, very softly but loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You've always been the most understanding one." And in that moment, I knew, whether I had said yes or no, they had already started acting as if my signature was only a matter of time. I stood there, my hand touching the rough edge of the old wooden table. The scratch on the corner was still there, a mark from when I was 18, when I tore up my acceptance letter to study abroad so I could stay and work at a factory, saving money to send my sister to an international school. My mother looked at the scratch, then at me, her expression unmoved. "You've always been the one who thinks the most in this family." One sentence used for 15 years in exchange for the smallest room, leftover meals, and my unpaid devotion to this family. They did not need my consent. They only needed my silence, like every other time. Moments like that did not leave visible wounds. They simply accumulated quietly. Every time I gave in, everything looked smoother on the surface. But that smoothness never brought fairness. It only created a new precedent, that I would continue to give and that this was to be expected. I left the house very early. No one saw me off, and no one asked where I was going. The familiar road leading to the highway looked the same as always, but it felt different. I drove straight to the office, where everything I had began with late nights, weekends without dates, and decisions made with no one backing me except myself. My career did not come from one lucky leap. It was pieced together from small contracts, demanding clients, and countless rejections followed by revisions. There were months when I paid my employees before paying myself. There were mornings when I opened my email with a heavy feeling in my chest because cash flow was still not enough. I never told my family about those things, not because I was hiding them, but because no one ever asked. When things became more stable, I invited my parents to the new office, not to show off, just to share. My mother walked around, touched the surface of the desk, and asked if I remembered to turn off the lights when I left. My father stood by the window looking down at the parking lot. He did not ask how many hours I worked in a day or whether I was tired. He turned to me and asked simply, "If this were sold, how much would it be worth?" The question landed faster than I expected. I stood still for a few seconds as if I had misheard. I answered with a number because that was all the question required. My father nodded and memorized it. The conversation moved on, as if it had just been a normal calculation. From then on, every time I moved one step further, my family viewed it in the same way. Not how hard did you work, but what can be done with it now. When I bought my first house, my mother asked about maintenance costs. When my business expanded, my brother asked whether I could temporarily help out with some money. All reasonable questions if placed on a balance sheet. They just never came with any others. I began to notice the small details, their expressions when my name came up in conversations about money, the way discussions always revolved around use, not preservation. I was still their child during holidays, but in important discussions, I felt more like a resource to be allocated. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, my father again asked about the current value of my work. His tone was not heavy or sharp. It was calm and familiar, like asking about the weather. I answered. Everyone kept eating, talking, laughing. No one noticed that my hand had paused in midair for a few seconds before I set my chopsticks down. The feeling was not loud. It was like realizing that the chair you were sitting on was no longer meant just for you. And in my mind, a question began to form without an answer yet. When did they start seeing me this way? That dinner ended earlier than usual. My mother called me home and said, "There's a family matter we need to discuss." Her voice was not rushed, but it gave me no choice. When I arrived, everyone was already seated around the table. My brother sat with his head lowered, his hands close together, staring at the empty space in front of him. My father sat at the head of the table, back straight, as if preparing for a meeting rather than a meal. No one spoke at first. The sound of spoons tapping against plates echoed a few times, then stopped. Finally, my mother began. She said my brother was having difficulties, a wrong decision, a debt that had grown faster than expected. Her words were chosen carefully, without blame. Everything was named as gently as possible, as if harsher words would make the situation too real. My brother did not look at me. My father added more, his voice even, as if recounting a series of objective events. He said the family had tried to manage it. They had sold a few things, borrowed what they could. Then he stopped. The entire table fell silent with him. I felt the shift of attention, slow and unmistakable. Everyone turned toward me at the same time. No one said outright that I had to help. They did not need to. My mother placed her hand on the table and said I had always been the stronger one, that I knew how to calculate, that I had the ability to handle things like this. My father nodded and added that the family had always been proud of how capable and independent I was. Those compliments did not lighten the weight. They felt like a list of responsibilities wrapped in nice paper. "Just this once," my mother said, her eyes fixed on me. "If you don't help, then who will?" The question hung in the air, not needing an answer. It was presented more as a conclusion than a question. I looked at my brother. He glanced up quickly, his eyes passing over me before dropping again. There was no apology, No explanation, only expectation, as if my stepping in were a given. I asked one very simple question. I asked for the exact number. My father gave an amount quickly, without hesitation. I nodded and remembered it. My mother added that everything would be fine if I helped this time. That afterward, the family would reassess and would not let me lose out. The promises came smoothly, just like all the times before. But one small detail made me pause. When I asked when this debt had started, the answer came more slowly. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked down at the table. My brother cleared his throat as if to fill the gap. The timeline mentioned was different from what I had heard before. Not by much, just off by a few months, but enough to make something feel wrong. The meal ended in an orderly way. Everyone stood up and cleaned up as usual. No one brought up the question I had just asked. I stayed seated a little longer, looking at the empty chair across from me. The pressure did not come from force. It came from how everything had been arranged so that my choice seemed to have only one direction. And for the first time, beneath all those reasonable-sounding words, I felt I was standing in front of a story that had not been fully told. That night, I did not go to sleep right away. I opened my laptop and placed it on the kitchen table, where the yellow light was just bright enough to see the screen without being harsh. Not because I wanted to doubt anyone, but because the numbers they had mentioned kept lingering in my head, unsettled. I reopened old emails, archived files I rarely touched, things usually used only for cross-checking. The debt my father described sounded straightforward. But when I traced back the starting point, the timeline did not match. It had begun several months earlier than what had been explained at dinner. I went through statements, small transfers, scattered, labeled with very generic notes. There was no sign of urgency, and it did not look like a one-time mistake. It looked like a series of prolonged decisions. I kept searching, not fast, not rushed, just slow clicks, as if moving too quickly would cause everything to slip away. In an old folder, I found an archived email. The subject line was short and unremarkable. The content was a forwarded message sent almost a year earlier mentioning temporarily drawing from family resources. My name was not in the recipient line, but one sentence made me stop. She'll understand like always. I read that email one more time. There was no request, no question, just an assumption already in place. The timing of the email matched the period when I had just completed a major project. The same one my family had only asked about in terms of its final value. I closed the laptop, then opened it again, as if I needed to be sure I had not misread it. Some families do not lie. They just leave things out. That thought echoed in my mind, not as a conclusion, but as a small opening where light could enter. What they had said at dinner was not entirely false. It was just missing the crucial parts. The real timing, the real scale, and the fact that they had counted on me from very early on, long before I had a chance to ask questions. I sat still, both hands resting on the table. In the quiet kitchen, the refrigerator hummed steadily. I thought about how neatly the story had been told. Reasonable, logical, and convenient. No one had asked me to keep a secret, but everything had been arranged so that if I spoke up, I would be the one disrupting things. When I opened my phone, a new message from my mother appeared. She asked whether I had finished thinking. There was no other question. I did not reply right away, not because I did not know what I would do, but because for the first time I understood that what they needed was not just my sacrifice. They needed the silence that came with it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Dim light from the window spilled into the kitchen, landing on the table where the laptop was still there, closed like a silent reminder. My phone vibrated. My mother's name showed up, short with no other icon. I watched the screen for a few breaths, then turned it face down, not to avoid it. I just needed time for everything to settle long enough. I sent a very short text. Give me a few days. No explanation, no promises. It was seen immediately. No reply. A small gap opened, just enough for me to feel my heartbeat slow down. During the day, I did familiar things, went to work, meetings, emails. By noon, my phone vibrated again. Then again. I let it ring until it stopped. In the afternoon, another message came in, this time from my father. He asked if I was okay. A short question, but in the wrong place. I read it, put the phone down, and kept working. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The white light exposed the tired lines at the corners of my eyes. I tied my hair back, took it down, then tied it again. The reflection wasn't unfamiliar, but something made me linger. That woman was used to nodding, used to smoothing everything over, used to standing last. I touched the mirror, as if checking whether that image was real. A memory flashed by, very quickly. Me standing in the kitchen years ago, my mother saying, "You understand," and me nodding before she even finished the sentence. The scene passed fast, but it left a thin mark in my chest. On the second day, the phone vibrated more constantly. Messages came more densely, and the tone changed. From gentle to impatient, from checking in to reminding. My mother wrote that everyone was waiting. My father said the family needed an answer soon. My brother sent a praying hands emoji, no words. I read them all and didn't respond. My hand rested on the table, my fingers tapping a slow rhythm. A sentence surfaced, very soft, not fully formed. If I don't sacrifice anymore, who am I? That question didn't need an answer right away. It just needed to exist. On the third day, my mother called. I let it ring. Then another message came in, shorter and more direct. Don't make this harder. I stood up and opened the window. Cool air poured in, carrying the steady sound of highway traffic. The pressure wasn't in the words anymore. It was in the growing urgency on the other side, as they realized I wasn't responding on the familiar rhythm. I went back to the house that afternoon without warning. The sky was overcast, and the wind pushed a few dry leaves against the steps with a light scraping hiss. My mother opened the door, her eyes flickering with surprise before closing again. She invited me in, her voice missing its usual patience. My father stood in the living room, arms crossed. My brother sat on the edge of the couch, folded forward, as if everything had already been decided. I didn't circle around it. I said I wasn't going to help in the way they wanted. No signing the paper, no stepping in to carry what was left. The room went quiet for a few seconds, then cracked open quickly. My mother spoke first. She asked if I knew what I was saying. My father said I was selfish, that I had put the family in a difficult position. Words piled on top of each other, rushed, no longer chosen as carefully as they had been at dinner the night before. My brother lifted his head, this time looking straight at me. He said I always had everything, and that helping him now was what I was supposed to do. No apology, no explanation. Just a bare demand. The first time it wasn't wrapped in gentle sentences. I stood still, my arms close to my sides. My heart was beating fast, but my voice didn't rise. I repeated what I'd said earlier more slowly. Not because I wanted to argue, but because I needed them to hear it clearly. My mother let out a small laugh, a laugh with no joy in it. She said I'd changed. My father stepped forward one pace, his voice hardening, asking when I had become like this. Get out of here, if you're that selfish. He didn't shout it. He said it clearly, decisively. No one stopped him. No one corrected him. I looked around the room, the place that had held family evenings, silent meals, and all the times I nodded just to move on. Everything was still there. I just wasn't standing in the familiar place anymore. Some families only love you when you lose. The thought crossed my mind, brief and clean, needing no explanation. I bent down and picked up my bag beside the chair. No one tried to keep me there. No one said anything else. I stepped toward the door, my hand closing around the cold knob. My mother turned away before I opened it. My father stood still, staring straight ahead, as if I was no longer there. Outside, cold air filled my lungs. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, then walked down the steps. No big drama, no goodbye, just a decision carried out by legs moving toward the car. Urns. And in that moment, between the noise that had just ended behind me, I felt something clearly. My resistance had begun, not with loud words, but with walking away at the right time. The days after that were quieter than I expected. No explosive confrontations, no retaliation from me. I only did one very specific, very dry thing. I removed my name from every guarantee and support I had been providing to keep my family afloat. The paperwork went out by email, clean electronic signatures, no message attached. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't explain. That morning, I got to the office early. The sky was still dim and the parking lot was almost empty. I made coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened my calendar. My life didn't stop just because of one tense afternoon at my parents' house. But somewhere, I knew certain gears had begun to slip out of sync. By noon, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I answered after a few rings. The man on the other end sounded clear and professional. He introduced himself as the attorney handling my family's file. His tone was different from the last time I'd heard him, no longer gentle or polite. He asked to confirm certain details, asked about whether I had withdrawn from my previous financial commitments. I answered briefly, directly. There was a short silence on the other end. Then he said, that changed a lot. That the contingency plans from before no longer applied. That my family would have to figure it out again from the beginning. He didn't blame me, and he didn't advise me. He just informed me the way people do when an important condition no longer exists. After the call, I stood up and looked out the window. Traffic moved steadily on the road, not faster, not slower because of my decision. I went back to my desk and continued my day. In the afternoon, messages started coming. When I shut the car door, the sound was short and final. For the first time, I left that house without asking permission, without setting a date to return. The road ahead opened straight, with no T-in, no longer urgent pushes. They were messier, more mixed. My mother asked if we could talk. My father texted that things were not okay. My brother called and I missed it. I didn't respond right away, not because I wanted them to panic, but because I had stopped standing in the middle to smooth everything over. What had been covered up before started to show, not because I exposed it, but because no one was holding it down anymore. The real numbers surfaced in conversations I was no longer part of. The stories were retold, and this time they weren't consistent. Each person had a different version, and for the first time, I wasn't there to stitch them into one smooth narrative. One evening, while I was cleaning the kitchen, my phone vibrated again. I saw my mother's name and set the phone down on the table. The buzzing lasted a few beats, then stopped. The kitchen went quiet again. I wiped my hands and hung the towel back on the hook. The feeling in my chest wasn't relief, and it wasn't satisfaction. It was cold and clear, like when you step out of a room and close the door, knowing that behind that door, everything will have to take responsibility for itself. When I officially withdrew my name from every financial guarantee, what I felt wasn't hatred. It was a calm so painful it almost hurt. If you followed this far, what do you feel toward this woman? Leave an emoji that shows whether you agree or disagree with what I did. In the weeks after, nothing collapsed in a single moment. It sagged slowly, like a house losing its supports one by one, the supports I had been standing in as for years. News came in fragments, through acquaintances, through missed calls, through half-finished sentences. The family had to sell a few things. Plans were postponed. Appointments were moved, without me in the middle to soften it. Every collision sounded louder. My mother called me many times in the first week. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she stayed silent for a long time on the other end. My father texted that everything was getting beyond control. My brother sent short messages, no longer asking for anything specific, just scattered questions. like he was searching for a familiar handhold. I read them, put the phone down, and kept working. Not because I couldn't help, but because this time I chose not to step back into the old position. One evening, I stopped by the grocery store on the way home. I bought enough for one person. When I got home, I cleaned the kitchen, set a plate on the table, poured a glass of water. Dinner happened in silence, no clinking spoons, no voices cutting in. I ate slowly, listening to the wall clock keep time. The light over the table formed a small circle, just enough for one person to sit in. After dinner, I stood there cleaning up. The chair across from me was empty. I didn't pull it closer, I left it there, as an emptiness that was allowed to exist. The feeling in my body wasn't light. It also wasn't as heavy as I had imagined. It was quiet, in the way it feels when you finally set something down after carrying it for too long. Sometimes when night came, the questions returned. Not loudly, just a soft knock from inside. I thought about all the times before, when things got messy and I was the one who stepped in and arranged it. This time, I let everything follow its own momentum. No one died because of it, but no one was being shielded anymore. One weekend afternoon, I received a message from a relative. They asked if I could stop by and talk to my parents. The question was written very politely. I read it, set my phone on the table, and looked out the window. The sky was gray, the wind light. I didn't answer right away. In that silence, a thought appeared without rushing. Does stopping make me truly selfish? The question didn't demand an immediate answer. It just sat there like the empty chair at dinner. I knew I would have to live with it, but at the same time, I also knew that for the first time in a long while, the steadiness wasn't coming from me sacrificing more. After that, I didn't go back to my parents' house again. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted to prove anything. It was simply that once a boundary had been set, I understood some distance had to stay in place so everything wouldn't keep getting hurt. I lost the family the way I used to know it, but in exchange, I kept the rest of my life. The cost wasn't small, but it was clear. There were mornings I woke up and felt empty. There were holidays that passed quickly, without long calls or crowded meals. I didn't feel happy about it, and I didn't feel like I'd won. But I didn't regret it either. Because if I went back to the old role, if I kept being the understanding one, at the exact moment they needed, I knew I would lose far more than that. The steadiness I have now doesn't come from everything being okay. It comes from not having to guess how much more I need to sacrifice in order to be allowed to stay. I don't need to prove I'm good, and I don't need to explain why I stopped. Some choices, once made, only need to be lived with in a decent way. I used to fear the word selfish. I feared being labeled, feared being misunderstood. But in the end, I realized there's a thin line between selfishness and self-respect. Refusing to be used doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you someone who takes responsibility for yourself. The story you just heard is fictional, inspired by real-life situations and very human experiences. The content was assisted by AI and edited by humans, with the hope of offering reflection and emotional value to viewers, not to encourage anyone to copy any actions in the story. Everyone has their own circumstances, their own pace, and the choices that fit them. If there's one small gift I can leave behind after this story, it's a simple reminder. Know the difference between sacrifice that comes from love and sacrifice that is treated like an obligation. When you start feeling like you're only valued for what you give, maybe it's time to stop and look more closely. Before we end, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story right now? In your familiar kitchen, in the car after a long day, or in a rare, quiet evening that belongs only to you? If this story made you nod at any point, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what touched you. Thank you for staying until the end. If you feel like this story gave you a little value or a little understanding, press like to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next videos, and share it if you think someone out there might need to hear this. Your presence here, even if it's just a view or a single comment, already means something.